Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to episode 103 of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today I am very pleased to have with me Andrea Bonime-Blanc, who recently released a new book entitled The Reputation Risk Handbook, Surviving and Thriving in the Age of Hyper-Transparency. I visit with her about her book and her practice in reputation risk. The episode is about 20 minutes. I hope you enjoy. Thank you. Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of the FCPA Compliance and Ethics Report. Today is my distinct pleasure to have Andrea Bonime-Blanc with me. She is a well-known contributor in the GRC, reputation, compliance, risk, ethics, a wide variety of fields. She and I have crossed paths virtually many times but never had the chance to visit, and she has recently come out with a new book and was really thrilled to see that press release come out. So I thought this was a very good, if not long overdue opportunity for me to see if I could get you on the podcast. You've taken some time from your very busy schedule to do so, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's a real pleasure to be part of your podcast, and I've been following you, as you say, for quite a while now. I admire the work that you've been doing, and it's an honor to be here to talk with you.
One of the things that I was really intrigued about with your current consulting practice is you're a lawyer. You started out you did the in-house world. You've actually created compliance programs, so you know the building blocks of compliance. But one of the things I've observed over the past 6 to 9 months is compliance officers are really moving beyond just having the building blocks in place. And it seems to me with the foundation you laid in-house and then your consulting work at Daylight Forensic and Navigant, and now out on your own with your own company, you're really helping companies and compliance officers move to that next level of influence. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think what's been happening in the marketplace over the last 10 years is that we've gone from being the building block makers to moving into a more executive leadership role. And I think that's really important in today's world as regulatory issues and other sort of reputational ESG, the environmental, social governance issues become more and more important to the global actors out there, whether they're businesses or nonprofits or even government agencies that need to worry about integrity and reputation issues. The role of the compliance officer, and I like to use words other than compliance actually. It's sort of part of my drivers is to start talking more of the business language, the language that business people are interested in hearing about, and I think we can connect much better with them. And we talk about people being risk and reputation and business integrity officers, where they can actually connect the dots of what they do from a compliance standpoint with what is necessary from a business strategy standpoint. But I agree with the comment you just made that the more we move into the leadership roles where we are connecting those dots across functions and to the business, the more seriously we'll be taken and more effective we'll be in helping the company manage its risks and reputation issues.
A little bit about your background, but could you tell the audience a little bit about the company you founded, GEC Risk Advisory, and what you do and what you bring to corporations now?
Sure. So I did start as a lawyer, as you said, back in the mid-'80s. I was a transactional international lawyer at a couple of big law firms. Then I went in-house and was a general counsel at a global power company, chief ethics and compliance officer at a big global media company, Bertelsmann. Then I was GC and chief risk compliance officer for a couple of other companies in the technology field. And you mentioned Daylight Navigant, which was more of a GC role than a consultant role. But one of the things that I learned through that whole experience of almost 20 years of being in-house in various global companies was that we were not doing enough to connect dots between functions when we were attacking issues of common interest, whether they were risk issues or compliance issues, and we were not doing enough to connect those dots back to the business strategy of the organization. And so my driver in having started GEC Risk 2 years ago was to start talking more of a strategic business language about these issues in a more holistic and sort of comprehensive way, talk about it as business integrity issues, risk issues, reputation issues, and talk at the highest levels of the organizations with boards, with C-suite, with senior executives who have responsibility for these issues, and help them really gain a more holistic, more strategic view on how they can make it percolate into their organization and help the organization add value.
You've been incredibly prolific in your writing, certainly in your speaking as well. But could you tell us about your latest book?
Sure. Well, thanks very much for helping to talk about this book. It's called The Reputation Risk Handbook, and the subtitle is Surviving and Thriving in the Age of Hypertransparency. And so the idea there really is to sort of put together the focus that I was just talking about, that I'm trying to convey to the higher levels of an organization, focus them on what is really the glue at the end of the day of all these different programs that we talk about, whether it's ethics, compliance, risk, sustainability, corporate responsibility, quality. All these things actually are part of the same whole, which is strategic reputation risk management. And so I started writing about reputation risk about 2 years ago. I have a column that I do for Ethical Corporation magazine where I tackle a topic every other month, more or less. And more I was sort of gravitating to the idea of what is reputation risk, why is it important? And there have been some very interesting studies and works that have been done in the last few years as well by others that helped me sort of focus more and more on that issue. And to me, reputation risk is really sort of an add-on risk that adheres itself to other risks. It's not a standalone risk. So people need to understand it as something that can make your already existing risk worse, or maybe give you an opportunity to make your reputation better. And so I started looking at this issue for this book because I wanted to sort of provide a very practical framework to managers and executives and board members on how to tackle this issue. And one of the driving reasons as well was there have been a couple of really good surveys that have been done by leading organizations like Deloitte and Eisner Amper, where they've surveyed board members and CEOs of companies around the world and asked them, what is your most important strategic risk? And bar none, they're showing reputation risk being on the top 5 or so of the risks that keep people up at night. And so I thought it was very important to put something practical together that hasn't been done before. So that's the reason why I wrote the book.
I think most senior executives and board members would understand damage to reputation or reputational risk in the context of loss of stock value, drop of price, some financial exposure, but they may not understand it going the other way, which is what actually happens either in your company or even, for better or worse, a third party can impact your reputational risk. Is that something you're finding traction with at board levels?
Absolutely. I just made a 4-hour workshop presentation to a board of a technology company a few days ago, and we really discussed this whole issue of reputation risk as sort of being that add-on risk that can really hurt not only the company but also the personal reputation of directors and leaders. And so I think it's something that really connects in a very visceral level in some ways. If you understand what your own reputation risk is, then you can start thinking about it in terms of the organization and think about how you can prevent that risk. And the whole purpose of the book, at the end, I have a framework that I provide sort of a strategic and tactical toolkit to organizations on how they might be able to think about reputation risk before it actually happens. And so it's resonating a lot, I think, with senior business people and directors, because it's a difficult issue to get your arms around, and that was part of the reason why I wanted to tackle it. Is let's make it tangible, let's make it practical, let's find ways to overcome it. And it's especially difficult in today's world when I call, my subtitle talks about the age of hypertransparency, meaning that things are happening so super quickly that and so impactfully, for better or for worse, that we really need to be equipped to deal with it.
Well, that brings up a question. A direct question question I wanted to pose. How does Mae West tie into hypertransparency?
Well, she may not connect directly with hypertransparency, but I do use a quote or two of hers at the beginning of the book, where she basically says something along the lines of, I don't have to worry about my reputation. I never had one. And that's not necessarily something we should all share. But in her case, it was actually true, because her lack of reputation was her livelihood. And most cases in most businesses and organizations, it's not having a bad reputation that gives you your livelihood. It's having a good reputation. So I use that as a sort of a humorous way to introduce the book. You know, if she lived in today's world where there's Twitter and LinkedIn and, you know, Instagram and all these other things, she probably would have been a raging success, even more than she was then, because she would have connected with a much bigger audience. But it's a good question, a funny question, obviously.
And the other phrase you used that really intrigued me was the Rashomon effect.
Yes.
And I wanted to pose the question to you as follows. How do you convey the information, enthusiasm, and really the tying it all together to groups within an organization who may have a different perspective? Senior management, the middle, the folks at the bottom, the folks at the front line who are out in Central Asia or West Africa or Far East, or name the location. Do they all have different perspectives?
Well, this is a terrific question, and that's part of the reason why I suggested in one of my chapters that when you're talking about reputation risk, you really are talking about this Rashomon perspective, which I'll explain very quickly. For those who know the Akira Kurosawa movie Rashomon from the 1950s, it's a story about something that occurs in the woods from 5 different people's perspective, and each of them have a completely different story to tell. And so to me, when it comes to reputation risk, you have all these stakeholders of an organization, and if the organization does something, each stakeholder may take a sliver of what's happened and have a completely different view of what's happened, and that creates an additional challenge to the company or the organization that's going through the reputational risk. So your point goes inside the organization and asks the same question of the different constituents of the internally in the organization. And I think that clearly that is another big challenge, where organizations need to have communications plans when they have a potential issue that's happened, that puts people on the same page, that gives them the information they need, that fills the gaps that the people in East Asia may not have if something happened in Australia or it happened in Europe. You want to, and if it's a big enough issue, you obviously want to have your team on the same page. So yeah, so the reputational risk issue is internal as well as external.
How are you able to convince or get a company to take the information that you conveyed, or the training you might give to the senior management, and move that down the chain to the middle and to the bottom?
Well, I think you use the right words. The training and education is the way to do it. And so, you know, if you can build, for example, a scenario that makes sense for your particular company when you're building your ethics and compliance or other kinds of programs, training programs, if you can introduce a reputational risk aspect to the standard training, standard scenario that you might be putting together, that will make people think. It'll trigger that sort of reputational risk thinking that I think is very important. That people, I don't think, do that right now, and I think that's an important ingredient. And one of the things I say when I put together the toolkit at the end of the book is this is not a suggestion that you create a whole new reputation risk function. It's the opposite. It's adding layers and tidbits to things that you already have. And so in the case of training, you want to have training that addresses a reputational risk that might happen to your company. So that's really the point there, and I think education and training are critically important in this regard.
That intrigued me, called, you said buckets of risk.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what that is?
This is how I've often explained it over the years. I've been in charge of risk management in several of the companies that I've worked for, as well as ethics and compliance. And so one of the things that you know, when you're looking at the overall sort of risk profile of an organization, there are going to be some big buckets of risk that apply to that organization. And so if you're a typical global company that's doing business in 40 countries with 10,000 employees or whatever, you're going to have certain predictable buckets of risk. Political risk is going to be one, financial risk is going to be another, ethics and compliance will be another, technology risk, legal and regulatory, and so on. So those are what I call the big buckets of risk. Reputation risk isn't one of those big buckets. It's not a standalone risk. It's really something that cuts across. So if you're not handling your anti-corruption risk, for example, properly, and something happens, your reputation risk is going to accelerate or increase. Then compared to a situation where you actually have prepared and something bad happens, and you can actually control or mitigate that reputational risk in addition to your anti-corruption situation. So that's kind of what I meant by big buckets.
What are some of the things that you would suggest a compliance officer, general counsel, or really, I guess, any senior manager or executive have in their toolkit to deal with some of these issues?
Great question. I think the foremost thing, it's part of sort of the strategic view of things that I'm trying to promote, is connect to the heads of other functions that have something to do with some of the issues that you're dealing with. So also be part of the whole risk management process. Know what the enterprise risk management folks are talking about and see where the compliance and ethics pieces fit in. I've been in a company, for example, that had an enterprise risk management program, but the ethics and compliance pieces were not in that program. And so I had to work together with the chief risk officer in this particular case to introduce 7 important ethics and compliance risks that were not in their worldview. And so I would suggest that compliance officers and general counsels have good relationships and frequent connections with chief risk officers, PR people, external affairs people, others who have views of what's going on in the world so that they can have a better. And I think the other thing which I've often not experienced often, but experienced a couple of times, but I preach about all the time, is companies need to have cross-functional teams attacking their common risks, and then reputation risk fits into that paradigm as well.
I was at a conference of a major multinational company this week, and I was observing the compliance function, sort of an interfunction conference, and the lawyers and compliance practitioners from outside the United States tended to talk about the company's values, and the lawyers inside the United States tended to talk about the rules. And I had observed that for several years, but the thing that struck me was how much more powerful the discussion of values was. And that seems to be an undercurrent of everything you have said, that get away from talking about the rules, guys.
I think you're going to connect with the business much faster if you demonstrate both understanding of the business, but also understanding of how culture and leadership are more important than rules. I mean, there's that famous, culture trumps compliance that people use frequently. I completely agree with that, and think that's the culture is really going to determine how you do compliance and ethics and other rules-based things. And so, my view actually comes from having grown up and been born and raised in Europe. And so I have sort of a more European perspective, maybe, although I've spent most of my life now in the U.S. and I'm a U.S. trained lawyer. So I have sort of both worldviews, and they compete with each other. But really, the competition is over. I see the value of having the rules and the laws and the compliance, but I really think it has to be stitched as part of a much more holistic sort of culture and leadership framework in organizations. And it starts with the top, obviously. It starts with the CEO setting the tone and the board holding the CEO accountable.
We're nearly at the end of our time, and I was wondering if people wanted to check out the book or find out a little bit about more you and your company, where could they go?
Well, thank you. You can go to gecrisk.com, and on the website you will find a book page, so you can take a look at the book. We've gotten some nice reviews, so I'm very excited about that. And then there's other information on the website. I have a upcoming events section, some videos. I did an IC interview with the New York Stock Exchange governance folks recently, and there's one coming up in about 2 weeks on reputation risk. So happy for people to visit me on my website, and if they have questions, they can contact me through there.
I was going to say, do you have a contact section on your website as well?
Yes, I do. So my email address is there, and it's abonimeblanc at gecrisk.com, and I tweet at Global Ethicist, and I'm on LinkedIn, so people can find me if they want to.
Well, Andrea, I greatly appreciate you taking the time to visit with me. This has been really interesting and enlightening for me. I hope to be able to utilize some or all of the things you've said in my practice, and I'm going to go to the website and buy the book.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. You're very gracious, and I appreciate you reaching out and including me in your podcast.
All right, thanks again.
Take care.